Venezuela and Cuba continue to strengthen ties and celebrate their shared successes at a meeting in Caracas. CARICOM head Mia Mottley condemns U.S. efforts to divide the Caribbean region. And French workers remain on the streets to combat the government's neoliberal pension reforms. Hello and welcome to Telesur English. I am Estefania Bravo. This is From the South. Top representatives of the Venezuelan and Cuban governments, including Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, have met in the Bolivar Room of the Miraflores Palace in Caracas as part of the 20th meeting of the Intergovernmental Commission of the Cuba-Venezuela Cooperation Agreement. Cuba and Venezuela celebrated their achievements and consolidated their joint interests and objectives. The two countries are solidifying their bilateral ties as the United States continues to tighten illegal and deadly sanctions against them.
Se ha desarrollado esta comisión.
Dear friends of the Commission of the Bolivar-Martí Cooperation Agreement, this commission has developed. It's the 20th meeting, the 20th year, on the 20th day of 2020. In October of this year, we're going to remember and commemorate accordingly the signing of this agreement in 2000. Which bears the names of Bolivar and Martí, signed by the Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro and Supreme Commander Hugo Chavez, here in this very presidential palace. Right here, Commander Fidel Castro's visit to Venezuela was an unforgettable one. He traveled around the country, from the east, the plains. He was also here, in Plaza Bolivar, where he gave an unforgettable speech and spoke about doing much with little and a new culture of work.
Del comandante Fidel Castro a Venezuela.
On Sunday, a session headed by Cuban Deputy Prime Minister Ricardo Cabrizas and Venezuelan Planning Minister Tarek El Aissami recalled some of the successful joint projects between the two countries. Apart from medical missions, Cuba has assisted in research and developmental plans aimed at improving food security in Venezuela.
We would like to express our deep gratitude for the generous help from the Venezuelan people through every difficult time we face, such as hurricanes and other climate events. Venezuela has always been the first to pledge humanitarian aid to our people. It's not possible to express in these brief words all of the significance and value of all these years of joint work during this important and opportune time. To recognize all of our collaborators, all Cuban and Venezuelan organs, to the people of Venezuela and their Bolivarian government, which has made it possible. The 20 years since the first Intergovernmental Commission meeting, we continue victoriously demonstrating advances and new proposals for the development of the two countries.
Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza is in Iran on an official visit. Minister Arreaza met with Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif. During their meeting, they discussed new bilateral projects in the agricultural, industrial, and scientific sectors, among others. This high-level visit by Arreaza seeks to strengthen cooperation bonds between the two nations and follows a similar diplomatic visit by the Bolivarian delegation to China last week. In further diplomatic successes for the Bolivarian government, the Pemón indigenous people in Venezuela will soon be seeing the repatriation of the Abuela Cueca stone as it begins its weeks-long journey back from Berlin 22 years after it was stolen. The jasper stone, which weighs around 30 tons and represents a person turned into stone, was taken from the Canaima National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, to Germany in 1998. The government at the time, under President Rafael Caldera, handed over the sacred stone despite protests by the Pemón people. The Grandma Cueca is the representation of a wise elderly woman, and in its place of origin is another stone symbolizing the grandfather, both ancestors of the Pemón people. The return of the Grandma Cueca to the Santa Cruz de Maupari is the result of years of struggle by the indigenous peoples themselves and of diplomacy by the Bolivarian government. Central American migrants in Guatemala are crossing the Suchiate River into Mexico. Close to 3,000 Honduran migrants had been wanting to cross the Rodolfo Robles border bridge in Tecunumán, but Mexican authorities closed the crossing as part of an agreement with the government of the United States to cut down irregular migration through its territory. Reports state the migrants gave authorities a deadline to open the crossing before looking for alternative points of entry into Mexico. This latest migrant caravan from Honduras set off on their journey north last Wednesday, fleeing a nation with the highest rates of poverty and violence in Central America.
Well, they don't want to allow us to pass practically. What's the reason? No one wants to talk. If they wanted to allow people to pass, they would have already done it. That's a lie. If they were really going to do it, they would have already had people standing in a line and would have people entering through one entryway. But that's not the logic. Everyone is going peacefully. The only thing we want is to cross. Legally, they don't want to allow it, so people want to enter by force.
Our correspondent Hugo Vera is at the border with the latest.
I'm here on the other side of the bridge in Chiapas, where the migrants crossed the river when the Mexican authorities didn't give their permission for them to cross into Mexican territory as they head to the United States. The Mexican authorities said that it would be illegal under Mexican migration law. Afterwards, there was a meeting between the migrants at which they decided to cross the river. The Mexican authorities obviously responded on the other side, but the migrants are now here. You can see around me. They're all waiting to see what will happen. The Mexican authorities' response was emphatic in saying that they wouldn't permit any crossing that didn't comply with Mexican migration laws. But the migrants are still here. And as we've commented on Telesur, these are people that are fleeing misery in their home countries, as well as a lack of opportunities.
We thank Hugo Vera for that report. And a new group of about 200 migrants have also set off from El Salvador to seek better opportunities in the United States. They said growing violence and poverty in El Salvador pushed them to take the perilous journey across Central America in hopes of reaching the U.S. border. This as a larger, mostly Honduran group faces challenges to cross the border from Guatemala to Mexico. Hundreds of people in the Brazilian state of Belo Horizonte have embarked on a 6-day protest march against mining giant Vale, almost a year after 259 people were killed when a dam owned by the company collapsed. The protesters will march through various mining towns before assembling at Vale's office in the town of Brumadinho, where the disaster occurred. They aim to expose the government's lack of will to hold the company responsible for the hundreds of deaths and injuries. Authorities have so far failed to indict any of Vale's executives. Our correspondent Brian Muir has more from Sao Paulo.
On January 25, 2019, shortly after far-right Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro took office, there was a horrible disaster in the town of Brumadinho in Minas Gerais state. The Vale Mining Corporation had a large lake of toxic waste that it was maintaining there, and the containing wall broke. It burst and toxic mud poured out over the town, killing 250 people. The resulting mudslide killed the Paraopeba River for hundreds of kilometers, and this affected the livelihoods of 1.3 million people who live in 48 towns along the riverbanks who are using that water for drinking and for agricultural purposes. Now today, on January 20th, a group of hundreds of survivors of that tragedy began a protest march in the state capital of Belo Horizonte. They're going to march from Belo Horizonte to Brumadinho. It's 300 kilometers, arriving there on the 25th to mark the one-year anniversary of the disaster. Along the way, they're going to have seminars and talk with people, and it's expected that the crowd of people marching is going to grow as it approaches its final destination. It's being sponsored by the Landless Rural Workers Movement, the MST, and also by the MAB, the movement of people affected by dams. And they're protesting a lack of response from both the government, the federal government, the state government, and the Vale Mining Company, which, although it gave some kind of settlement to the families of the people killed in the disaster, hasn't done anything for the estimated 1 million people who now have toxic metal poisoning due to their irresponsibility as a company.
Coming up after the break, the African Union comes out swinging against illegal sanctions on Zimbabwe. Stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. CARICOM head Mia Amor Motley says her country will be boycotting a meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in Jamaica set for Tuesday. The Barbados Prime Minister said the decision was taken as only some regional heads were invited, a move she dubbed divisive.
I am conscious that in the next week questions will be asked as to whether the Barbados Foreign Minister happened to be missing from a meeting in Kingston, in Jamaica, that will take place on Tuesday. And we don't look to pick fights. I don't look to pick fights. But I am conscious that if this country does not stand for something, then it will fall for anything. As chairman of CARICOM, it is impossible for me to agree that my foreign minister should attend a meeting with anyone to which members of CARICOM are not invited. If some are invited and not all, then it is an attempt to divide this region.
Meanwhile, the government of Trinidad and Tobago says it fully supports Barbados' decision not to send a representative to Pompeo's meeting in Jamaica. Prime Minister Keith Rowley said his government shares Barbados' view that the meeting goes against the principles and vision of unity among Caribbean nations. He added that his country will not entertain any attempts by outsiders to divide CARICOM members. Starting Tuesday, Pompeo will be in Jamaica for a two-day visit where he will meet with Prime Minister Andrew Holmes and several other Caribbean leaders. They are expected to discuss the recent flare-up in the Middle East and matters pertaining to Venezuela. This visit is a year after the Jamaican Prime Minister and four other regional heads met with U.S. President Donald Trump in Florida. The White House had tried to bribe countries to vote against the legitimate government of Venezuela and the President Nicolás Maduro with potential investment at an Organization of American States Forum.
So we thank you again for the invitation.
With the murder toll at 26 so far this year, Trinidad and Tobago's National Security Minister has raised questions about who stands to benefit from crime. This as he implied that criminal elements are being encouraged to commit heinous acts.
Why is it that suddenly there are these instances, people driving along certain main roads and just being shot at? Police officers, on some instances, who were shot at, but there was absolutely no intelligence or no link of them to anything whatsoever. And we began looking at it. We then began to put certain pieces of the puzzle together, that there are certain people in our society who want to create the impression and create a sense of fear and to create a sense of panic in Trinidad and Tobago about what they call the runaway rate of crime.
Islamist militants have attacked a United Nations aid facility in Nigeria. Though no aid workers were harmed in the assault, one soldier and four assailants died in the ensuing gunfight. The Islamist militants stormed the facility in trucks fitted with machine guns, looting stores and burning buildings and carting away food and medicines. The UN said that one of the few vehicles UN agencies rely on for movement and aid delivery was also torched. The humanitarian hub is located near a camp holding 55,000 displaced people in northeastern Nigeria. A South African court has opened an inquest into the death of trade unionist and anti-apartheid activist Neil Agate, 38 years after his death. Agate, a medical doctor and trade unionist, was found hanging in his cell on February 5, 1982 at the notorious John Worcester police station in Johannesburg, 70 days after being held in detention without trial. Authorities at the time claimed that he committed suicide, but his family and fellow activists have insisted that he was tortured to death during interrogations. More than 30 witnesses are expected to testify at the inquest.
And the reality is that they were brutally tortured. And the security branch had to find means of covering up their heinous activities. And they came up with these issues of committing suicide or jumping from a window or slipping on a bar of soap. So it's imperative that the Agate family has an opportunity to revisit the inquest findings of the 80s and that the ultimate truth emerges.
Africa's third largest airline, South African Airways, has denied reports that ceasing operations after it failed to meet the deadline to secure a bailout from the government. A statement by the airline said all flights will operate normally while management continues to engage the National Treasury for $140 million bailout. The funding is part of the bankruptcy protection deal the airline signed with its creditors late last year. The airline was Africa's largest, has in the last decade suffered a deterioration of its finances due to gross mismanagement. The Zimbabwean government has announced the measures to revive floundering state companies. The country's vice president said the government has come up with a strategy to bring back companies which have either closed down or have been hurt due to economic hardships. As part of the program, the country has already started receiving new planes from Malaysia to strengthen the national airline. Most of the country's industries have suffered due to crippling sanctions imposed by the United States and its European partners.
The government's commitment to the revival of state enterprises and parastatals has taken a new direction and a new thrust. As you may all recall, state enterprises and parastatals used to contribute around 40% of our country's gross domestic product. Unfortunately, most of, if not all, of these public entities have suffered from a host of challenges, including the economic decline caused by illegal sanctions imposed upon us by determined and unashamed perpetrators of underdevelopment in third world countries.
And the African Union has intensified its fight against sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe. During a recent state visit to the country, the African Union's chairman of the panel of the wise, Amre Musa, said the bloc has agreed to increase pressure for the sanctions to be unconditionally removed.
The implications of the sanctions on the economy, on development of the country, on the society, on the poor people, on the young people, on the women, etc. We discussed all that. The consensus amongst us, the AU representatives and the high officials of this country, was that we have to work together to lift the sanctions as quickly as we can.
Meanwhile, students in Zimbabwe's second capital, Bulawayo, have demonstrated against the deteriorating education system. Hundreds abandoned classes and took to the streets protesting against the rising cost of education, poor working conditions for teachers, and a lack of proper facilities. Recently, the government froze the cost of school as a way of relieving parents from the already high cost of living. Still to come, the former Catalonia police chief is on a trial for rebellion for a supposedly passive response to pro-independent protests. Welcome back to Premise Off. Hundreds of protesters have been met with police repression during a march in the city of Versailles in France. Demonstrators are on the streets protesting against pension reform while President Emmanuel Macron holds a Choose France summit nearby. The French president is hosting executives from all over the world to praise a France that welcomes companies with open arms. Workers have condemned Macron's administration draft pension reform bill that includes a contested clause on raising the retirement age by 2 years to 64, among other things.
Clearly, the government is refusing to withdraw this reform. This reform is unjust, and we can see it. In fact, they have granted several benefits to certain sectors, notably the police, and now they're not going to be affected. And we realize that the reform for equality for all workers is actually a sham. It's worthless.
It's a demonstration that's been declared, so we were right in front. We were pushed. They wanted us to turn back, to stay on the square, in front of the Versailles Chantier station, simply so that we don't make a noise and are not visible. That's all. So we were actually pushed back. So we tried to put our hands up to show that we are not violent and that we are here to demonstrate. It's a right.
The former police chief of Catalonia stands trial over his role in the region's independence bid from Spain in 2017. Josep Luis Trapero appeared in court on charges of rebellion with prosecutors, seeking an 11-year jail sentence. Trapero is accused of ordering his regional police force to remain passive during sovereignty movement demonstrations, while Spain's national police cracked down on protesters using batons, tear gas, and firing rubber bullets. Trapero's trial comes just 3 months after Spain's Supreme Court handed out jail terms to 9 Catalan sovereignty movement leaders, prompting weeks of protests in Catalonia. The new Iranian Quds Force commander has vowed to avenge the assassination of his predecessor Qasem Soleimani. The newly appointed commander Ismail Ghani said Soleimani was killed in what he described as a cowardly way by the United States.
The United States hit Qasem Soleimani in a cowardly way. But, with God's grace, and through endeavours of freedom seekers around the world who want vengeance over his blood, we will hit his enemy in a manly fashion.
2 protesters and 2 police officers were killed in the Iraqi cities of Baghdad and Basra on Monday as anti-government protests resumed. The 2 protesters were killed in Baghdad's Tehran Square after security forces used live ammunition. Meanwhile, in Basra, 2 policemen were run over by a civilian car, sources said. The driver was reportedly trying to avoid the clashes. Demonstrators say Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi has not fulfilled any of his promises, including an overhaul of a corrupt political system that has kept most Iraqis in poverty. Libya's prime minister has called for the international community to put pressure on Khalifa Haftar to release oil fields recently seized by his forces. Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj said Libya faces a catastrophe if the eastern-based commander does not lift the blockade he has put in place on the country's oil fields. Haftar's forces closed Libya's major oil port on Friday, resulting in the reduction of production.
I hope that the international foreign players understand the depth of this problem. I hope that they understand that stopping the only source of revenue for Libyans will cause a problem here.
And finally, a new SARS-like virus has killed at least 3 people in China, with almost 140 new cases discovered over the weekend in the city of Wuhan. Authorities have implemented the use of body temperature cameras at the Wuhan railway station and airport to detect the infection, expressing fear the epidemic could turn into a major outbreak as millions begin traveling for the Lunar New Year. First discovered in the central city of Wuhan, the virus has caused alarm because of its connection to severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS for short. Over 200 people have been diagnosed with the virus in China.
I would like to emphasize that since the epidemic started, the Chinese side has taken serious, earnest, and professional attitude to actively deal with it and formulate a strict prevention and control plan. We are sparing no effort in treating patients and in managing those who have close contact with them. We have launched a thorough epidemiological investigation and have released relevant information about epidemic prevention and control in a timely manner, and have actively launched publicity campaigns on disease prevention knowledge.
And with that, we've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Stefania Bravo. Until next time.